An isolated millionaire, surrounded by cameras and distrust, sees his silent mansion awaken again when a new housekeeper crosses his path. She brings light to what was dead, but also a secret capable of destroying everything or healing wounds that money could never reach. If you enjoy stories like this, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. The rain fell relentlessly over Windsor, lashing the colonial roofs and transforming the cobblestone streets into small rivers. High on one of the most exclusive hills of the imperial city, almost hidden by a sea of centuries-old Scots pines, stood the Alistair family's mansion. The neoclassical manor, with its imposing columns and tall windows, once hosted grand parties that gathered the British elite, but now remained silent, like an empty shell abandoned by the sea. Gustavo Mendonça. Alistair watched the storm through his office window, slowly swirling the glass of whiskey between his fingers. At 42, he was the man behind Mentech, one of the country's largest software companies. His fortune was incalculable, but his dark brown eyes, once vibrant, now seemed like two empty wells incapable of reflecting any emotion. The sound of the intercom interrupted his thoughts. Without diverting his gaze from the rain, he pressed the device's button. "Mr. Alistair," said the voice of Alfred, the butler who had worked for the family for over 2 decades. "The candidate for the nanny position has arrived. Shall I send her in, or would you prefer to postpone the interview due to the rain?" Gustavo hesitated. In the past 6 months, he had interviewed and dismissed 5 nannies. None of them seemed trustworthy enough to care for Michael, his son who was only 14 months old. The last one had been caught by security cameras searching the drawers of the master bedroom. Before her, another was caught on the phone, passing information about the house's routine to an unknown person. Paranoia slowly consumed him. "Send her in, Alfred," he finally replied, "and take her to the green room. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Before going down for the interview, Gustavo stopped in his son's room. Michael slept peacefully in his crib, oblivious to the storm outside. His small eyes, unable to see the world around him, remained closed in deep sleep. Gustavo felt a pang in his chest. His son was blind from birth, a condition discovered only weeks after Caroline's passing during childbirth. Caroline Vance Alistair had been the only person who truly understood him, who loved him despite his flaws. When she left, she took with her Gustavo's capacity to trust, to surrender, to love. What remained was just an empty shell, a rich man but emotionally bankrupt. "Good night, son," he whispered without touching the baby. Physical contact was something Gustavo avoided. The coldness was not intentional, but the result of years of disappointments and betrayals. "Daddy will find someone who will take good care of you, I promise." As he descended the marble staircase leading to the ground floor, Gustavo felt the cold that dominated the mansion. Despite the modern heating systems, there was a kind of cold that no technology could combat. The cold that comes from within, from loneliness, from emptiness. The green room, so named for its soft, moss-green walls and dark wood furnishings, was one of the few rooms in the house that still held some life. It was the last room Caroline decorated before she left, and Gustavo hadn't had the heart to change it. Upon entering, he found the candidate sitting in one of the leather armchairs, intently observing the family photographs on the mantelpiece. She was a young woman, probably in her 30s, with dark hair tied back in a simple bun. She wore modest but clean and well-pressed clothes. There was something in her posture that conveyed an unusual serenity. "Good evening," Gustavo said, keeping a safe distance. "I am Gustavo Alistair." The woman immediately stood up with a smile that lit up her face with delicate features and olive skin. "Good evening, Mr. Alistair. I am Louisa Sterling. Pleased to meet you." Her voice was melodious, with a slight regional accent that betrayed her rural origins. Gustavo indicated for her to sit down again and took a seat in the opposite armchair. For a few seconds he silently analyzed her, searching for signs of falsehood, of ulterior motives. It was a habit he had developed after being repeatedly betrayed by people he trusted. "Alfred gave me your CV, but I prefer to hear directly from you. What is your experience with children, especially with babies with special needs?" Louisa adjusted herself in the armchair. Her eyes, a light brown, almost amber, held Gustavo's gaze without faltering. "I worked for 5 years at the Manchester Children's Hospital in the neonatology department. caring for newborns, many with special needs. After that, I was a nanny in 2 different homes, always with young children. My last experience was with a family in Oxford, where I cared for twins, one of whom had cerebral palsy. Gustavo nodded, showing neither approval nor disapproval. And why did you leave your last job? The question seemed to bother Louisa, who averted her gaze for the first time. The family moved to Ireland. They offered for me to go with them, but... She paused, as if choosing her words. I have personal reasons to remain in England. What reasons? The question sounded harsher than Gustavo intended. My mother is ill. I need to be close to care for her. The answer came quickly, but there was something in her intonation that triggered an alarm in Gustavo's already suspicious mind. I see. And what do you know about my son? Only what Mr. Alfred informed me by phone. Michael is 14 months old, is blind, and lost his mother during childbirth. I imagine he needs specific stimuli for his sensory development, especially auditory and tactile. The technical precision of the answer surprised Gustavo. Do you have a nursing background? Yes, I am a nursing technician with a specialization in neonatal care. I also took courses on child development and early stimulation for visually impaired children. The conversation continued for over an hour. Gustavo asked questions about hypothetical situations, testing not only Louisa's technical knowledge, but also her judgment and ability to handle emergencies. The answers were always precise, professional, almost too perfect. You seem very qualified, Mrs. Sterling, Gustavo finally said, standing up. But I must be frank. My son's safety is my absolute priority. If I hire you, there will be strict rules to follow. Certain areas of the house are restricted. All your activities will be monitored. I expect absolute discretion about everything you see or hear within this house. Are we clear? Louisa also stood up, maintaining her dignified posture. Perfectly, Mr. Alistair. I understand your concerns and respect them. My only interest is to provide the best care for little Michael. There was something in the sincerity of those amber eyes that almost made Gustavo lower his defenses. But years of distrust do not unravel in minutes. Alfred will show you to your quarters. You start tomorrow, with a 30-day probationary period. Any suspicious behavior will result in immediate dismissal, without prior notice. Good night. Without waiting for a reply, Gustavo left the room, leaving behind a slightly perplexed but determined Louisa. As he climbed the stairs back to his office, a strange sensation invaded him. There was something about that woman, something he couldn't quite define, something that bothered him and at the same time awakened a curiosity that had been dormant for years. Upon reaching the corridor, Gustavo stopped before the monitor displaying the security camera footage. He watched Alfred escorting Louisa through the winter garden towards the staff wing. The rain had subsided, and a few moonbeams managed to penetrate the clouds, illuminating the stone path. "Alfred," he called through the intercom. "When the candidate leaves, come to my office. I want you to install additional cameras in the staff wing and in Michael's room." "Yes, sir," the butler replied, his voice betraying a slight tone of disapproval. Gustavo ignored him. He knew that the older staff did not approve of his obsession with security, his constant distrust. But they didn't understand. They didn't know what it was like to be repeatedly betrayed by people he trusted. They didn't know what it was like to lose everything that mattered. The next day, Louisa arrived promptly at 7 o'clock in the morning. She wore a simple uniform, white trousers and a light blue blouse, and carried a small bag with personal items and what appeared to be sensory toys for Michael. Gustavo watched through the entrance hall camera as Alfred greeted her. There was something in the way she moved, something in the way her eyes scanned the surroundings, an excessive carefulness, as if she was aware of being watched. One more reason not to trust, he murmured to himself, as he zoomed in the camera to better observe the new nanny's expression. What Gustavo didn't know was that this woman of simple appearance and gentle smile carried secrets that would forever change the history of that family. Secrets that, like dormant seeds, awaited only the right moment to blossom and reveal truths long buried by time. In the weeks following Louisa's arrival, the routine at the Alistair family mansion began to subtly change. Michael, previously so silent and apathetic, now made small sounds of contentment when he heard the nanny's voice. Mornings in the house, which once seemed to drag on in oppressive silence, gained new sounds. Lullabies, soft laughter, the tinkling of sensory. Toys? Gustavo observed everything from a distance through the screens of the monitors in his office. He had installed additional cameras throughout the house, including some hidden in decorative objects, a photo frame here, a plant pot there, to capture angles that conventional cameras couldn't reach. It was a Sunday morning when he noticed something unusual. Louisa was in Michael's room, believing she was alone with the baby. She held the little one in her lap, humming softly as she swayed from side to side. So far, nothing out of the ordinary. What caught Gustavo's attention was the dialogue that followed. "You know, Michael," she said, stroking the boy's dark hair, "you look so much like your mother. You have the same chin, the same face shape. But your eyes are your father's." Gustavo frowned, intrigued. How could Louisa know who Michael resembled? She had never seen a photo of Caroline. All photographs of his late wife were kept in his private room, an area strictly forbidden to staff. At another moment, 2 days later, Gustavo caught Louisa in even more suspicious behavior. She was alone in the library, a room rarely frequented since Caroline's departure, as she was an avid reader. Louisa walked slowly among the shelves, as if looking for something specific. Her fingers slid along the spines of the books until they stopped at a particular volume, a photo album of the Alistair family. Gustavo felt his heart quicken as he watched the nanny delicately leaf through the album. She stopped on a specific page and her face transformed. It wasn't the expression of mere curiosity one would expect from a nosy employee, but something deeper, more personal. Her eyes welled up, and she touched one of the photographs with her fingertips, whispering words that the audio system couldn't fully capture. Only one name was clearly audible: Anthony. Anthony Alistair, Gustavo's father, deceased for over 15 years. How did Louisa know his name? Why did she react with such emotion to a photograph of him? Gustavo's suspicions multiplied. During dinner that night, a solitary meal in the immense dining room while Louisa fed Michael in the kitchen, he couldn't get the tormenting questions out of his head. Who was this woman really? What was she looking for in his house? Was it just a coincidence? Or was there some obscure motive behind her arrival? "Alfred," he called through the intercom, "please ask Mrs. Sterling to come to the dining room." Minutes later, Louisa entered the room. She was slightly flushed from her kitchen activities, but maintained the dignified posture that characterized her. "You called, sir?" Gustavo indicated the chair opposite him. "Please sit down. Is Michael already asleep?" "Yes, sir. I just put him in his crib. Mrs. Gertrude is keeping an eye on him while I'm here." Mrs. Gertrude was the housekeeper, an elderly lady who had worked for the Alistair family longer than Alfred. Gustavo poured himself more wine, studying Louisa's face over the rim of his glass. "I'm curious, Mrs. Sterling. You mentioned your mother is ill. What exactly is her condition?" The question seemed to catch Louisa by surprise. She hesitated for an instant before replying. "She has heart problems. Aftermath of an emergency surgery performed many years ago. And where does she currently live?" "In Oxford, sir." "With my elder sister." "I see." Gustavo took a sip of wine without averting his gaze. "And you've never been to Windsor before?" Louisa swallowed hard. "Actually, I have. As a child." "My mother? She worked here in the region for a while." "As a domestic helper?" "Yes, sir." "In which house?" Louisa's hesitation was almost imperceptible, but Gustavo, trained by years of difficult negotiations, caught the exact moment she decided not to tell the whole truth. "I don't remember exactly. I was very young." A lie. Gustavo could taste the lie in the air, as bitter as the wine he had just drunk. But he decided not to press. "Not yet. Well, I hope your mother recovers soon. You may withdraw. Good night." "Good night, Mr. Alistair, and thank you for asking about my mother." When Louisa left, Gustavo remained motionless for long minutes, observing the wine in his glass. Questions multiplied in his mind, feeding his natural paranoia. Perhaps he was being unfair. Perhaps Louisa was exactly what she seemed, a dedicated professional who was doing a good job with Michael. But what if she wasn't? What if there was a larger plan behind everything? His intuition, that sixth sense that had helped him build his business empire, screamed that something was wrong, something undisclosed. The next day, while working in his office, Gustavo received a call that would elevate his suspicions to a new level. "Mr. Alistair, this is Dr. Marion Taylor." The family lawyer's voice sounded concerned. "I received a notification that I believe you need to see immediately." "What is it about, doctor?" "Edward Vance, your late wife's cousin, has filed a petition for the custody of little Michael." Gustavo felt as if the ground disappeared beneath his feet. Edward Vance, a man he had known only superficially at Caroline's funeral, a distant relative who suddenly showed interest in his son. "On what grounds?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The petition alleges emotional neglect and an unsuitable environment for the development of a child with special needs." The lawyer paused. "He specifically mentions the high turnover of nannies and your difficulty in forming bonds with your son." The words struck Gustavo like precise arrows. It was true that he had difficulty showing affection for Michael. Not for lack of love, but for fear. Fear of becoming too attached, of suffering another loss, of not being the father the boy deserved. "This is absurd," he murmured, more to himself than to the lawyer. "Edward barely knows Michael. What does he really want?" The petition mentions that he and his wife cannot have biological children, and that, as Caroline's relative, he feels a moral duty to offer Michael a stable family environment. "Or perhaps he's interested in the fortune Michael will inherit when he turns 18, Gustavo countered, cynicism surfacing. "Schedule a meeting as soon as possible, doctor. We'll sort this out." Upon hanging up the phone, Gustavo turned his attention back to the monitors. Louisa was in the garden with Michael, allowing the baby to touch different textures: the soft petals of flowers, the roughness of tree bark, the smoothness of the grass. The expression on the little one's face was one of pure enchantment, even without being able to see what he was touching. The scene should have been comforting, but Gustavo could only think of the unsettling coincidences. Louisa had arrived shortly before Edward's petition. She showed knowledge about Caroline and his father that she shouldn't have. And now a distant relative of his late wife wanted to take his son from him. Was Louisa part of some scheme? Was she passing information to Edward, helping him build the case for neglect? Gustavo's paranoia, already naturally high, reached alarming levels. That same night, after everyone had retired, he did something he had sworn never to do. He invaded an employee's quarters. Louisa's room in the staff wing was simple but welcoming. She had brought few personal belongings, some modest clothes, a few books, a small old stereo. Gustavo searched every drawer, every pocket, looking for any evidence that would confirm his suspicions. It was in the last drawer of the dresser that he found something that made his heart turn to ice: a yellowed envelope containing an old photograph. In the image, his father, Anthony Alistair, smiled beside a young woman with familiar features. On the back of the photograph, a date, March 15, 1992, and an inscription: "To Cecilia, with eternal gratitude, Anthony." Cecilia. Louisa's mother's name. Gustavo sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph trembling in his hands. The pieces were beginning to fit, but something crucial was still missing. What was the connection between Louisa, his father, and Caroline? And how did this relate to the custody petition initiated by Edward? As he put the photograph back in the envelope, a small metallic object fell to the floor. Picking it up, Gustavo immediately recognized it: a silver locket that had belonged to his family for generations. The same locket his father always carried in his pocket, like a good luck charm, and which Gustavo believed had been buried with him. Inside the locket, another miniature photograph, his father beside the same woman from the previous photo. At that moment, Gustavo heard footsteps in the corridor. Quickly, he put the locket and the photograph back where he had found them and hid behind the door of the small adjoining bathroom. Through the crack, he saw Louisa enter the room, looking worried. She went directly to the dresser, opened the drawer where the envelope and locket were kept, and checked if both were still there. A sigh of relief escaped her lips as she found the objects intact. She picked up the locket, pressed it against her chest, and murmured words that chilled Gustavo's blood. "I will keep my promise, Mother. For you, for Anthony, and for Caroline's last wish." The next morning dawned cloudy in Windsor, a perfect reflection of Gustavo's state of mind. The discovery of the photograph and the locket had disturbed his sleep, bringing back fragments of long-buried memories. Memories of his father, Anthony, always so generous and approachable, so different from the distant and distrustful man he himself had become. At breakfast, Gustavo observed Louisa with renewed attention. She fed Michael homemade baby food, chatting animatedly with the baby, as if he could respond. There was a naturalness in her gestures, a genuine tenderness that didn't seem staged. "Michael is adapting well to the routine," Gustavo commented, breaking the usual silence. Louisa looked at him with surprise. Rarely did the master of the house initiate a conversation during meals. "Yes, sir. He's a very intelligent boy. Even without sight, he perceives everything around him. Just yesterday, he managed to identify the sound of the rain and was fascinated." Gustavo nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "You seem to understand a lot about child development." "I learned a lot at the hospital," she replied simply. "Every child is unique, especially those with special needs." A momentary silence hung between them, filled only by the sounds Michael made as he ate. Gustavo wanted to confront her, to ask about the locket, about the photograph, about the words he had heard the night before. But something stopped him. A part of him, perhaps the same part that still preserved fragments of the boy he once was, wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation for all of it. "I have a meeting with Dr. Marion today," he finally said, "about a legal matter involving Michael. I'll be out for most of the day." "I understand, sir." "Michael will be well cared for." There was something in Louisa's gaze, a shadow of concern, perhaps knowledge. That made Gustavo wonder if she already knew about the custody petition. Hours later, in Dr. Marion Taylor's office, in the historic center of Windsor, Gustavo faced the lawyer with a mixture of anger and despair. "They don't have a case, do they?" he asked, after the detailed explanation about the petition filed by Edward Vance. Marion adjusted her thin-framed glasses, a gesture she always made when she had to deliver difficult news. "Edward has hired one of the best law firms in London. They are arguing that you are emotionally unstable, traumatized by Caroline's loss, incapable of establishing emotional bonds with Michael. They claim that the child lives in isolation, without adequate social interaction, and that the turnover of staff demonstrates an unstable environment." "This is absurd!" Gustavo stood up, pacing nervously around the office. "Michael has everything he needs. The best doctors, the best therapists. The house has been adapted for his needs." "I know that," Marion agreed. "But the petition isn't about material comfort, Gustavo. It's about emotional well-being. Edward is requesting a psychological evaluation of you and a visit from social workers to the mansion." Gustavo stopped before the window, observing the historic square below, where ordinary people lived simple lives, without the burden of fortunes and betrayals. "What does he really want, Marion?" "Money?" The lawyer hesitated. "I don't think so. Edward and his wife, Monica, truly cannot have biological children. And from what we've gathered, their financial situation is comfortable. He is an oncologist. She is a university professor. So why now? Why, after more than a year since Caroline's passing, does he suddenly take an interest in Michael?" Marion flipped through a few pages of the petition. "According to the attached testimony, Edward tried to make contact several times after Caroline's passing, but you supposedly pushed him away. He claims he respected your mourning for a while, but is now concerned about Michael's development." "I barely know this man." Gustavo sat down again, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Caroline rarely spoke of him." "In any case," Marion continued, "and we need to prepare. Provide proof that Michael is receiving all necessary care, including affection and appropriate stimulation." Gustavo thought of Louisa, of how Michael responded positively to her. She was the first nanny with whom the baby truly seemed to establish a connection. "The current nanny has been competent," he admitted. "That's good, keep her. Stability is crucial at this time." The conversation continued for another hour, discussing legal strategies and preparations for the social worker's visit. When he finally left the office, Gustavo felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The possibility of losing Michael, the last connection he had with Caroline, was unbearable. Back at the mansion, the first thing he noticed was the sound. Classical music, soft and melodious, filled the previously silent air. Following the melody, he reached the living room, where he found a scene that left him momentarily speechless. Luisa was sitting at the old piano, an instrument that had belonged to Gustavo's mother and that no one had played for decades. Her fingers glided over the keys with surprising skill, while Michael, sitting on her lap, clapped his small hands to the rhythm of the music, laughing with delight at each note. For a moment Gustavo allowed himself only to observe. There was an almost painful beauty in that scene, like a glimpse of an alternative life, a reality where his family was still whole and happy. "I didn't know you played the piano, Mrs. Sterling," he finally said, announcing his presence. Louisa abruptly stopped the music, turning around with a start. "Mr. Alistair, I didn't hear you come in. I apologize for the presumption. I saw the piano and thought it would be good for Michael's auditory development." "You don't need to apologize." Gustavo approached, noticing how Michael stretched his little arms towards him upon hearing his voice. A gesture that, he realized with a pang of guilt, rarely received a response. "Please continue." "Michael seems to be enjoying it." With hesitation, Louisa began to play again, this time a soft lullaby. Michael leaned back against her, his sightless eyes slowly closing, lulled by the melody. "Who taught you to play?" Gustavo asked, sitting in a nearby armchair. "My mother," Louisa replied without interrupting the music. "She was a pianist when she was young. She gave lessons to supplement her income." "Cecilia, right? That's your mother's name." Louisa's fingers hesitated for an instant, an off-key note escaping before she regained the rhythm. "Yes, Cecilia Sterling. And she worked in Windsor, as I understand it." "Many years ago, yes." Gustavo watched Louisa's face intently, searching for signs of nervousness or untruth. "By any chance for the Alistair family?" The silence that followed was the answer Gustavo expected. Louisa stopped playing but kept her hands on the keys, as if seeking physical support. "You already know the answer," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "What I know," Gustavo replied, keeping his voice low so as not to wake Michael, who was now asleep in her arms, "is that I found a photograph of my father with a woman I believe to be your mother, and also a locket that has belonged to my family for generations." Louisa closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. "You were in my room." It wasn't a question, and Gustavo didn't deny it. "I want to know the truth, Mrs. Sterling, all of it. Who are you, really? What are you looking for in my house? And what do you have to do with the custody petition filed by Edward Vance?" At the mention of the petition, Louisa's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "Custody petition? I don't know what you're talking about. Who is Edward Vance?" The reaction seemed too sincere to be faked. Gustavo studied her for a few more seconds before deciding that she genuinely didn't know about the petition. "Caroline's cousin," he explained briefly. "He's trying to gain custody of Michael, claiming I'm emotionally unstable and unable to care for him properly." Louisa visibly paled. "That's terrible and unfair. That's what my lawyer says too. But let's return to the main subject. The locket, the photograph. My father." Louisa adjusted Michael in her arms, as if seeking comfort in the presence of the innocent child. The baby slept deeply, oblivious to the tension filling the air. "It's a long story, Mr. Alistair. I have all night," he replied, indicating with a gesture that she could begin. With a deep sigh, Louisa began to narrate a story Gustavo had never imagined. "My mother, Cecilia, started working for your father when I was only 5 years old. We were very poor. My father had abandoned us, leaving my mother alone with 3 small daughters. Your father, Anthony Alistair, hired her as a housekeeper for this very house." Gustavo nodded. He vaguely remembered a kind housekeeper who had worked for the family during his adolescence, but he had never paid much attention to the staff back then. "We worked here for almost 3 years, Louisa continued. "They were happy times despite the poverty. Your father was a good, just man. He treated the staff with respect, something rare among wealthy employers of that era. But then, my mother began to feel chest pains. Pains she hid from everyone, including us, her daughters." Louisa's voice trembled slightly. "One day she collapsed while working. Doctors diagnosed a severe heart problem. She needed urgent surgery, but we had no money or health insurance. And my father paid for the surgery," Gustavo completed, the pieces falling into place. "That's what the inscription on the photograph means. With eternal gratitude." "Yes," Louisa confirmed, a solitary tear rolling down her face. "Your father not only paid for the surgery, but also arranged for us to have a place to live during her recovery. He gave my mother the locket before the operation, saying it was a good luck charm of the Alistair family, which had protected them for generations. But why are you here now? Why did you specifically seek employment in my house? Louisa hesitated, adjusting Michael in her arms. The baby slept deeply, oblivious to the tension filling the air. My mother made me promise on her deathbed that one day I would repay Anthony Alistair's kindness, that I would help his family if they needed it, just as he had helped us. Your mother. She's not ill in Oxford, is she? Louisa shook her head negatively, more tears welling in her eyes. She left us 6 months ago. Cancer. Gustavo absorbed the information in silence. There was truth in Louisa's words, he could feel it. But something still didn't quite fit. How did you know about Michael? About my need for a nanny? Louisa averted her gaze, suddenly seeming very vulnerable. This is the hardest part to explain, Mr. Alistair, and I fear you won't believe me. Try. Louisa took a deep breath, like someone preparing for a leap into the dark. I met your wife, Caroline, at the hospital. I was a nurse on the day she was admitted for childbirth. A shiver ran down Gustavo's spine. The coincidence seemed too impossible. I was on duty in the maternity ward, Louisa continued. It was a difficult birth from the start. There were complications. Louisa's voice faltered, and Gustavo felt his heart clench. He had never been able to talk about the details of that day, the day he gained a son and lost the love of his life. Caroline was a strong, courageous woman, Louisa continued, after a moment's pause. Even when the doctors said the situation was serious, she remained calm. She thought only of the baby. When she realized there wouldn't be time, Louisa stopped, tears now streaming freely down her face. Gustavo felt paralyzed, caught between the desire to know the truth and the terror of reliving that pain. Continue, he asked, his voice almost unrecognizable. She held my hand, Louisa whispered. She squeezed so hard it left marks, and she said, take care of him for me. Promise you'll take care of my son if something happens. I promised without knowing who she was. It was only later, when they were filling out the documentation, that I saw the surname, Alistair. Gustavo stood up abruptly, unable to remain seated. The story was unbelievable, too fantastic to be true. And yet it explained everything. Louisa's knowledge of Caroline, her natural ability with Michael, her determination to work in that specific house. Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning? He asked, his voice tense with contained emotion. Would you have believed me? Louisa retorted with a hint of bitterness. A stranger appearing at your door, telling a story about deathbed promises and impossible coincidences. You who trusts no one? The words hit Gustavo like a physical blow. It was true. His distrust had become so intense, so consuming, that the idea of selfless kindness now seemed like an alien concept. So you came here to fulfill a promise, he said, more to himself than to Louisa. 2 promises, in fact. One made to your mother and one to my wife. Yes, Louisa confirmed. I have no other motive. I don't want money, I don't want a position. I have no connection with this Edward or anyone else who might want to harm you or Michael. I simply came to fulfill what I promised to 2 women who meant a great deal to me. Gustavo stared at her for a long moment. His entire adult life had been built on the premise that people always have ulterior motives, that genuine kindness does not exist. It was easier, safer to believe that everyone would eventually betray him. But now before him stood a woman who challenged all those beliefs, a woman who had entered his life, guided only by promises of kindness and gratitude. A woman who in a few short weeks had brought more light and joy to his son's life than he himself had managed in over a year. I need to think, he finally said, his voice tense. Please take Michael to his room. Louisa nodded silently, standing up with the sleeping baby in her arms. As she passed Gustavo on her way to the door, she paused briefly. Your wife loved you very much, she said in a low voice. Her last words were your name and a request for us to care for Michael. He is a precious gift, Mr. Alistair, a gift that deserves to be loved without reservations, without fear. With those words, Louisa left, leaving Gustavo alone with his swirling thoughts and an impossible decision to make. Gustavo spent the entire night in his office, a storm of conflicting emotions and thoughts raging in his mind. Louisa's words echoed incessantly, challenging everything he believed about people and their motivations. The idea that someone could act out of pure kindness, without self-interest, seemed so distant from his reality that it was almost impossible to accept. Around 3 in the morning, seized by a growing restlessness, he went to a room in the mansion he rarely visited, his father's old study. The room remained practically untouched since Anthony Alastair's passing, preserved as a kind of sanctuary to his memory. Upon entering, the familiar scent of old books and aged wood instantly transported him back to his childhood. He remembered how, as a boy, he would watch his father work at that same solid oak desk, always with a welcoming smile on his lips, even on the most difficult days. Anthony Alastair had been the opposite of the son he had become. While Gustavo had built walls around himself, his father had always kept his doors open. Where Gustavo saw potential enemies, Anthony had seen friends yet unknown. His father's generosity was legendary in Windsor, something that at the time young Gustavo considered naivete. "How did you do it, father?" he murmured to the framed portrait on the wall, which showed a middle-aged Anthony with a wide smile and kind eyes. "How did you trust people knowing they could hurt you?" As if answering his question, Gustavo's gaze fell upon the old desk. A side drawer, always locked, caught his attention. He remembered that after his father's passing, he had never had the courage to open it. The key remained kept in a safe in his own office. Moved by an impulse he couldn't explain, Gustavo retrieved the key and, minutes later, was back, kneeling before the desk, hesitating only for a moment before inserting the small bronze key into the lock. Inside the drawer, he found several carefully organized envelopes. Each contained the name of a different person, written in his father's elegant handwriting. Flipping through quickly, he recognized the names of former employees, business partners, family friends, and then a name jumped out at him. "Gustavo, to be read when I am no longer here." With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and took out several pages of paper, yellowed by time. A letter dated a few months before his father's passing. "My dearest son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it is because I am no longer by your side. There are things I tried to teach you in life, but I know that some lessons only time and experience can truly convey. The most important of these is about trust." Gustavo felt a lump form in his throat as he continued reading. To trust is not an act of naivety, as many think. It is an act of courage. It is choosing to believe in the best of people, even knowing they can disappoint us. For you see, my son, the moment we stop trusting, the moment we close our hearts out of fear of pain, that is when we truly lose. The words penetrated deep into Gustavo's soul, as if his father were there, speaking directly to him after all these years. "You will always see me helping people, extending a hand to those in need. I do not do so expecting reciprocity, but because I believe that every act of kindness creates a ripple that spreads far beyond what we can see. Perhaps you do not understand this now, but one day you will." The letter continued, speaking of business, of family, of the values Anthony hoped his son would preserve. But it was the last paragraph that made the tears, so long contained, finally overflow from Gustavo's eyes. "And if one day, my son, any of Cecilia Sterling's children, or of any other person I have helped knock on your door, I ask that you receive them as family. For family is not just the blood we share, but also the bonds of gratitude, respect, and love that we build throughout life. This is my last request. Keep your heart open, even when the world gives you reasons to close it." Gustavo let the pages fall onto his lap, his body shaken by silent sobs. For the first time since Caroline's departure, he allowed himself to fully feel the pain, the loss, the fear he had been suppressing behind walls of distrust and coldness. When the sun began to rise, painting the Windsor sky with shades of pink and gold, a decision had been made in his heart. Louisa was in the kitchen, preparing Michael's bottle when Gustavo entered. His eyes were red from crying and lack of sleep, but there was a new determination in them. "Good morning, Mr. Alastair," she said hesitantly, uncertain how to proceed after the previous night's conversation. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling." Gustavo's voice came out hoarse, tired. "We need to talk, but first I want to apologize." The expression of surprise on Louisa's face would have been comical in other circumstances. "Apologies," For invading your privacy, for doubting your intentions, for not being the man my father expected me to be. Louisa placed the bottle on the counter, all her attention turned to her employer. You don't owe me an apology. I understand your distrust. My story truly sounds implausible. But it's true, Gustavo affirmed, not as a question but as a realization. I read a letter from my father last night. A letter he wrote before he passed, for me to read after he was no longer here. In it, he explicitly mentions your mother, Cecilia, and asks that I welcome her children as family, should they ever need help. Louisa's eyes filled with tears. He was an extraordinary man, your father. Yes, he was. And I distanced myself from everything he represented, from everything he taught me. Gustavo ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his weariness and vulnerability. I lost myself in my own bitterness, in my fear. I built this fortress not to protect Michael, but to hide from the world. Louisa said nothing, merely listened, offering the space Gustavo needed to finally open his heart. Edward's petition, he continued, made me realize how much I had distanced myself from Michael, my own son, and I can barely touch him without feeling panic. Not for lack of love, but for fear. Fear of not being enough, of losing him as I lost Caroline. Mr. Alistair, Louisa interrupted softly, Michael senses your presence. When you enter a room, he becomes agitated, turns his head towards your voice. He knows his father, even if you don't realize it. The words struck Gustavo deeply. I want to change, Mrs. Sterling. I need to change. For Michael, for myself. And I would like you to help me. How can I help you? Gustavo took a deep breath, like someone preparing for a leap of faith. I want you to stay with us, not as an employee, but as part of the family. Michael needs your presence, your affection, and I need to relearn how to trust. The proposal took Louisa by surprise. You want me to stay as what exactly? As an aunt to Michael, someone who will have a permanent place in his life, who will help guide him to love him, someone who fulfilled not one but two sacred promises to be here. Gustavo hesitated for a moment before continuing. I will offer you a dignified salary, an official position in the company as a consultant for accessibility programs, and a place in this house for as long as you wish to stay. Silent tears streamed down Louisa's face. You don't need to offer me any of this. I came to care for Michael, to fulfill my promises. I seek no compensation. I know, Gustavo replied with a small smile. The first genuine one in a long time. That's exactly why I'm offering, because you didn't ask, didn't demand, didn't manipulate. You simply came and brought light to this house that had long lived in darkness. At that moment, Michael's crying echoed from the baby monitor on the counter. Louisa made a move to pick up the bottle, but Gustavo stopped her with a gentle gesture. Let me go, he said. It's time to start being the father Michael deserves. As he climbed the stairs towards his son's room, Gustavo felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The distrust, the bitterness, the fear, all of it was still there, but now it seemed smaller, less significant compared to the decision he had made. Upon entering the room, he found Michael agitated in his crib, his small arms outstretched as if seeking comfort. Without hesitation, Gustavo picked him up, cradling him against his chest in a way he had never done before. Good morning, my son, he whispered, feeling the fragility and warmth of the small body. Daddy is here, and I promise I always will be. Michael, as if understanding the magnitude of the moment, calmed instantly, snuggling against his father. And so in the silence of that room, bathed in the golden morning light, a new promise was sealed, not with words, but with the purest of embraces. In the weeks that followed, the Alistair family mansion transformed. The first changes were subtle. Open curtains letting in more light, soft music echoing through the corridors, the aroma of homemade bread coming from the kitchen. But soon, more significant alterations began to occur. Gustavo ordered the removal of all surveillance cameras, except those strictly necessary for external security. The doors, once constantly locked, now remained open. Staff who had been kept at a distance for years noticed the change in their employer. A greeting here, a question about family there, small gestures that indicated a man trying to reconnect with the world. Louisa, now officially Michael's aunt, became a constant and luminous presence. Under her gentle influence, The mansion's coldness gave way to an atmosphere of warmth and life. Vases with fresh flowers adorned the rooms, toys were scattered around the living room, family photographs, including a newly framed one of Cecilia with Anthony, gained prominence on the walls. The silver locket, a symbol of the improbable connection between the two families, was placed in a glass case in the main drawing room, accompanied by a small explanatory plaque to remember that kindness crosses generations. The most significant transformation, however, was that of Gustavo himself. Day after day, he allowed himself to be more present in Michael's life. He learned to change nappies, to bathe him, to recognize his son's different cries. He discovered that despite his blindness, Michael was extremely sensitive to textures, sounds, and smells, developing his own method of communication through touch and voice. On a particularly pleasant afternoon, while the three, Gustavo, Michael, and Luisa, were in the garden enjoying the mild autumn sun, the intercom rang. It was Dr. Marion with news about the custody petition. "Edward Vance has withdrawn the petition," she announced, her voice filled with relief. Apparently, the social workers' reports who visited the house last week were extremely positive. They highlighted the welcoming environment, the evident bond between you and Michael, and Mrs. Sterling's beneficial presence as a supportive figure. Edward decided he no longer had grounds to contest your custody. Gustavo felt a wave of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, Marion, for everything. Don't thank me. You did the hardest part, you changed. And everyone can see that." After hanging up, Gustavo shared the news with Luisa, who smiled broadly. "I never doubted you would win this case," she said, helping Michael feel a jasmine flower. "So you just needed to remember who you truly are." "And who am I truly, Mrs. Sterling?" Gustavo asked, genuinely curious. "Anthony Alistair's son," she replied simply. "A man with an infinite capacity for kindness and generosity. A man who just needed to remember what it's like to love without fear." That night, as he put Michael to sleep, a ritual he now shared with Luisa, Gustavo realized how complete he felt. The mansion, once cold and oppressive, was now truly a home. The shadows of the past, the betrayals and disappointments, had not vanished from his memory, but they no longer dominated his present or determined his future. Luisa approached silently, observing father and son with a serene smile. "You know," Gustavo said softly, so as not to wake Michael, who had fallen asleep in his arms, "I think I understand now what my father meant in his letter, about trust being an act of courage. And what do you think he meant? That it's worth taking the risk. That even knowing we might get hurt again, the price of not trusting, of not loving, is infinitely greater." Luisa nodded, her amber eyes shining in the soft light of the bedside lamp. "Your wife would be proud, you know, to see the father you've become, the man you've returned to being." Gustavo felt his eyes well up, but this time he didn't fight back the tears. He had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but rather the purest form of strength. "I believe so," he replied, placing a gentle kiss on his sleeping son's forehead. "And my father would be too. Both are here in a way through the promises you kept, Luisa." As he placed Michael in his crib, Gustavo reflected on life's unexpected turns. How a series of seemingly disconnected events, his father's kindness decades ago, a promise made on a hospital bed, the arrival of a stranger at his door, had intertwined to save him from his own darkness. The silver locket, now proudly displayed in the living room, was more than a family heirloom. It was a symbol of how kindness is never lost, of how the invisible bonds that connect us are stronger than any adversity. It was living proof that sometimes the most important people in our lives enter through paths we would never imagine, guided by forces beyond our comprehension. At the Alistair mansion, the oppressive silence gave way to laughter, music, and joyful footsteps. The windows, once closed, now let in not only the sunlight but also the hope of better days. And at the center of it all, three people united not by blood, but by something equally powerful, promises made from the heart and fulfilled with love.